London, 1858. The November rain drummed against the narrow attic window of the townhouse on Clarges Street, each drop a small percussion marking the passage of another grey afternoon in a life that had grown accustomed to grey afternoons. Eleanor Ashworth sat cross-legged on the worn wooden floor, her dark wool dress pooling around her like spilled ink, and lifted the lid of a camphor wood box that had accompanied her through 38 years of life, though most of its contents spoke only to the first 18. The attic smelled of dust and old lavender, of things carefully preserved but rarely visited, and the single window allowed just enough pale light to illuminate the treasures she had spread before her like an archaeologist examining artifacts from a civilization long extinct. There were ribbons once white, but now yellowed to the color of old ivory, their satin surfaces cracked where they had been folded too long in the same creases. There were dried flowers, roses mostly, that crumbled at the slightest touch, their fragrance long departed, leaving only the ghost of what they had begun. There were letters in a young girl's enthusiastic hand, written to school friends whose faces Eleanor could no longer quite conjure, and a small leather volume of poetry with her maiden initials embossed in gold on the cover, though the gold had mostly flaked away. But it was the dance cards that held her attention now, as they always did when she opened this box, as they had done perhaps 100 times over the years, in moments of melancholy or reminiscence or simple curiosity about the girl she had once been to. There were 12 of them in all, each one an elegant rectangle of thick ivory cardstock edged in gold filigree, each one bearing the name of a different ball or assembly from the London season of 1838, and each one, every single one, completely blank. Eleanor lifted the first card, running her finger along the printed lines where gentlemen's names should have been inscribed, where promises of waltzes and quadrilles and country dances should have been recorded, where evidence of her desirability and social success should have been permanently marked. The card from the Hartley Ball, April 1838. Not a single line filled. The card from the Montrose Assembly, May 1838. Empty. The Cavendish Musicale, the Pemberton Supper Dance, the Grand G Finale at Almack's itself. All blank, all unsigned. All testament to a season spent standing against silk-papered walls while other girls whirled past in the arms of eager gentlemen. She had kept them, she told herself, as a reminder that her worth was not determined by such superficial measures, but the care with which she had preserved them, the frequency with which she revisited them, suggested a wound that had never quite healed, a question that had never been answered about why she had been so thoroughly overlooked. The sound of footsteps on the narrow attic stairs pulled Eleanor from her reverie, and she looked up to see her niece Charlotte emerging into the dusty space, her young face flushed from the climb, her golden curls escaping from their pins in a way that would have horrified her mother, but which made her look charmingly dishevelled. Charlotte was 19th, the same age Eleanor had been during that long-ago debut season, and she possessed the same relation to Eleanor's sister Catherine as Eleanor once had to Catherine herself, which was to say she lived perpetually in the shadow of greater beauty. But where Eleanor had responded to this condition by retreating into books and resignation, Charlotte maintained an irrepressible optimism that Eleanor found both touching and faintly exhausting. The girl's eyes widened as she took in the scene before her, the opened box, the scattered mementos, and most particularly the array of dance cards spread across the floor like a fortune-teller's cards offering glimpses into the past. "Aunt Eleanor!" Charlotte exclaimed, settling herself on the floor with the unself-conscious grace of youth. "I have been searching everywhere for you. Mamma said you had disappeared after luncheon, and I thought perhaps you had gone for a walk despite the rain. But here you are in the attic with what are those?" Eleanor smiled, though it did not quite reach her eyes, and gestured to the cards. "Relics of my youth, dear Charlotte. Evidence of a season spent learning that not all young ladies are destined for the pleasures of the ballroom. Charlotte picked up the nearest card, the one from the Montrose Assembly, and examined it with a small frown creasing her smooth forehead. "But, Aunt, these are dance cards, are they not? The printed lines for gentlemen's names, the order of dances listed. Yet they are all blank. Why would you keep dance cards with no names written on them?" The question, asked with such genuine puzzlement, struck Eleanor with unexpected force, and for a moment she could not answer, could only look at these artifacts of her invisible youth and wonder herself why she had preserved them so carefully all these years. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady though something in her chest tightened painfully. "Because no gentleman ever requested my hand for a dance during my entire debut season. Charlotte, not one, not a single waltz or quadrille or even a simple country dance. I attended every major ball and assembly that season, wore the gowns my mother had made especially for the occasion, learned all the steps from the dancing master, practiced my conversation and my posture and my smile. But when the music began, I stood against the wall and watched as every other girl was led onto the floor. The cards remained blank because no one ever asked to sign them." Charlotte's expression shifted from puzzlement to shock, her mouth forming a small O of disbelief. "But Aunt Eleanor, that cannot be. You are so accomplished, so well-read and clever and kind. How could no gentleman have asked you to dance?" Eleanor reached out and gently took the card from Charlotte's hand, tracing the empty lines with her finger in a gesture she had performed so many times it had become almost ritual. "Beauty and youth are the currency of the marriage mart, my dear, and I possessed neither in sufficient quantity. Oh, I was young enough in years, but I lacked the vivacity and sparkle that draws gentlemen's attention. I was too serious, too bookish, too inclined to honest conversation rather than flattering nonsense. And most importantly, I had the great misfortune of having a sister who possessed beauty and charm in such abundance that she eclipsed every other girl in the room, myself most especially." "Your mother," Charlotte said quietly, and it was not a question. Eleanor nodded. Catherine was 17 that season, making her debut a year before custom strictly required because she was already so polished, so ready for society. She had golden hair that caught the candlelight, a laugh that made gentlemen smile, and a way of making each man feel as though he were the only person in the room. I loved her desperately, as I still do, but I also learned that season what it meant to be invisible. To stand 3 feet away from someone who commands all attention and realize that you might as well not exist. Every ball, every assembly, I would position myself near the refreshment table or by the potted palms, and I would watch Catherine's dance card fill within the first quarter hour while mine remained pristine. By the end of the season, I had stopped bringing them at all, but these 12 I kept, perhaps as a reminder of that time, perhaps as a sort of penance. I am not entirely sure. Charlotte's eyes had filled with tears, and she reached out to grasp Eleanor's hand with surprising strength. "That is the cruelest thing I have ever heard, Aunt. How did you bear it? How did you survive watching your own sister receive all the attention while you were left alone?" Eleanor squeezed her niece's hand, touched by the girl's fierce empathy. "I bore it because I had no choice, and because I eventually came to understand that my worth was not determined by whether a gentleman signed a card or asked me to waltz. I found other sources of meaning, other ways to fill my life. I read voraciously, I studied art and music and languages. I traveled when I could afford it. I involved myself in charitable works. I built a life that had substance and purpose, even if it lacked the romantic fulfillment that society tells us is the pinnacle of female existence. And now, at 38, I am content with my choices, or at least I have made peace with them." The rain had intensified, drumming harder against the roof, and the light from the small window had dimmed to a pearly grey that made the attic feel even more like a place outside of time, a pocket universe where past and present existed simultaneously. Charlotte studied her aunt's face with an intensity that suggested she was seeing her clearly for the first time, looking past the familiar figure of Aunt Eleanor, who supervised her reading and corrected her French and occasionally accompanied her to modest social gatherings, and seeing instead a woman with her own history of disappointment and resilience. "But you kept them," Charlotte said softly, gesturing to the dance cards. "If you had truly made peace with that season, if you had truly found your worth elsewhere, would you not have discarded these long ago? They serve no practical purpose. They hold no happy memories. Yet here they are, preserved as carefully as if they were precious." Eleanor felt her composure waver, felt the carefully constructed narrative she had built around her spinsterhood begin to crack at the edges. "You are wiser than your years, Charlotte," she said, her voice not quite steady. "You are right, of course. I have told myself for 20 years that these cards are merely curiosities, reminders of a different time, objects of historical interest about the cruelty and superficiality of the marriage market. But the truth is more complicated." She paused, gathering the cards together and holding them against her chest, as though they were something precious, or perhaps something that needed to be contained. "I kept them because they are proof that I existed during that season, even if no one noticed. I kept them because destroying them would feel like erasing that girl entirely, the earnest, hopeful young woman who believed that perhaps someone might see past her plain face and quiet manner to the person underneath. I kept them because, even now, 2 decades later, there is a part of me that wonders what I lacked, what essential quality of femininity or charm I was born without that rendered me so thoroughly invisible. And I kept them," she admitted, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "because they remind me that my worth is not determined by whether a gentleman signed a card, and I have spent 20 years needing that reminder almost daily." The two women sat in silence for a long moment, the rain and the gathering dusk creating a cocoon of intimacy around them. Charlotte still held her aunt's hand, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a note of determination that reminded Eleanor of herself at that age, before disappointment had taught her to lower her expectations. "I think, Aunt Eleanor, that those gentlemen were fools, and that their failure to ask you to dance says everything about their lack of discernment and nothing about your worth. And I think that somewhere in London there must be a gentleman with enough intelligence to recognize what they missed." Eleanor smiled sadly and began gathering the cards back into their box, each one carefully placed so as not to bend or damage them. "That is kind of you, dear, but I am 38 years old and well past the age of such romantic notions. Whatever chances I might have had have long since passed. I am content with my life as it is, truly. I have my books, my music, my charitable work with the Foundling Hospital, and I have you and your mother, however complicated that relationship may be. I do not need a gentleman to validate my existence." Charlotte looked as though she wanted to argue further, but something in Eleanor's expression forestalled her, and instead she simply helped gather the remaining mementos back into the camphorwood box. As they worked in companionable silence, Eleanor found herself looking once more at the blank dance cards, at those pristine lines that had never been filled, and felt the familiar ache of old rejection mixed with something else, something she could not quite name. It was the feeling of unfinished business, of a story that had ended too abruptly, of music that had stopped before the final movement. She closed the lid of the box and latched it firmly, as though she could contain not just the physical objects, but also the emotions they evoked, and followed Charlotte down the narrow stairs toward the warmth and light of the house below, leaving the attic and its treasured emptiness behind, though not, she knew, forgotten. The next afternoon arrived with the brittle sunshine that sometimes follows London rain, the kind of pale November light that illuminates without warming, and Eleanor found herself walking the familiar route to Lady Pemberton's townhouse in Mayfair, her steps quickening as the chill air bit through her wool cloak. Lady Pemberton was one of the few remnants of Eleanor's debut season who had maintained a connection with her across the intervening decades, though their friendship had less to do with that shared history, and more to do with Lady Pemberton's genuine appreciation for intelligent conversation, a quality she found lamentably rare among her social circle. The widow of a minor diplomat, Lady Pemberton occupied a unique position in society as a woman of impeccable breeding and modest means, who moved freely between various social strata, equally comfortable discussing philosophy with blue stockings or exchanging gossip with matrons, and her drawing room had become something of a salon for those who valued substance over spectacle. Eleanor was shown into the familiar blue and gold drawing room by a maid who had served Lady Pemberton for at least 2 decades, and she found her hostess already seated near the fire, the tea service arranged on a low table between 2 comfortable chairs that had molded themselves over years to the shapes of their occupants. Lady Pemberton herself was perhaps 65, with silver hair arranged in a simple style that required neither elaborate pinning nor youthful affectation. And she possessed the sort of handsome features that improved with age rather than fading, her face bearing the character of a life fully lived. "My dear Eleanor," Lady Pemberton said warmly, rising to embrace her guest with the easy affection of long friendship, "how fortuitous that you should call today. I have the most extraordinary piece of news, the sort that has set every drawing-room in London buzzing with speculation." Eleanor settled into her accustomed chair and accepted a cup of tea, noting with amusement that Lady Pemberton had barely waited for the conventional pleasantries before launching into her topic. "You know I am not one for gossip," she said with a small smile, "but I confess I am curious what could cause such widespread excitement." Lady Pemberton leaned forward with the air of someone about to impart intelligence of genuine significance. "The Duke of Ashford has returned to London after 15 years abroad. Thomas Bancroft. Do you remember him from your season? He was already titled then, though only recently, having inherited from his uncle just the year before." Eleanor's hand stilled on her teacup, and for a moment she could not speak, could not move, could only hear that name echoing in her mind like a bell struck in an empty cathedral. Thomas Bancroft, the Duke of Ashford. She had not heard that name spoken aloud in nearly 20 years, had not permitted herself to think it except in the deepest privacy of her own thoughts, yet here it was, dropped casually into Lady Pemberton's elegant drawing-room as though it were mere gossip rather than something that sent tremors through the carefully constructed foundations of Eleanor's composure. "I remember him slightly," Eleanor managed to say, proud that her voice remained steady, even as her pulse quickened. "He was not in London very long that season, if I recall. He married an Italian heiress rather suddenly and departed for the continent." Lady Pemberton nodded vigorously, clearly delighted to have an audience for her intelligence. Francesca Morelli, the daughter of a Venetian banking family. "They say the marriage was arranged to save the Ashford estates from financial ruin, as the old Duke had been rather profligate and left considerable debts. Thomas Bancroft did his duty, married the girl, took her fortune, and carried her off to Italy where they lived for 5 years before tragedy struck. She died in childbirth, along with the infant, and the Duke has been in self-imposed exile ever since. 15 years in Venice and Florence and Rome, never returning to England even once, as though he could not bear to face the life he had left behind." Eleanor sipped her tea carefully, using the mundane action to steady herself. "That is terribly sad. To lose a wife and child must be a grief beyond imagining." Lady Pemberton's expression grew thoughtful. Indeed, though those who knew him before say the marriage was one of convenience rather than affection. Still, guilt can be as powerful as grief, perhaps more so. They say he has changed entirely. The man who left England was full of life and charm, quick to laugh, generous with his attention. The man who returned is described as grave, withdrawn, almost ghostly in his demeanour, as though the best part of him died in that Italian villa, and only the shell returned to London. Eleanor felt something twist in her chest, a strange mixture of sorrow and recognition. "Perhaps we all become ghosts of who we were meant to be," she said softly, more to herself than to her companion. "Life has a way of extracting its toll, and we pay with the parts of ourselves that were most vital." Lady Pemberton regarded her with sharp eyes that missed very little. "That is unusually melancholic, even for you, my dear. Do you have some particular connection to the Duke that I am not aware of?" Eleanor shook her head, perhaps too quickly. "No, we were never introduced formally. I merely remember seeing him at one or two events during my season. He cut a striking figure, as I recall, handsome, well-mannered, much sought after by the mothers of eligible daughters. But then he left rather abruptly, and I confess I gave him little thought afterward." The lie felt bitter on her tongue, but Eleanor had long ago learned that some truths were too precious and too painful to be shared, even with friends. The reality was that she remembered Thomas Bancroft with a clarity that frightened her, remembered him with the kind of detail that suggested her young heart had catalogued every glimpse she had caught of him during that season. She remembered his height, the way he stood a full head taller than most men in a ballroom, and the breadth of his shoulders beneath perfectly tailored evening coats. She remembered his dark hair that held a slight wave despite being smoothed back with pomade, and the way one lock would sometimes fall forward across his forehead when he bowed. She remembered his laugh, rich and genuine, carrying across crowded rooms and making her wish she could be the cause of such unguarded joy. And most of all, she remembered the Montrose Ball in May of 1838, when she had been standing near the potted palms that lined the ballroom, half hidden as was her custom, and he had walked past so close that she caught the scent of his cologne, something with notes of sandalwood and bergamot. For one extraordinary moment their eyes had met, his grey eyes looking directly into hers, and she had felt a jolt of recognition so powerful it had stolen her breath. But then someone had called his name, and he had turned away, and she had convinced herself over the years that she had imagined the intensity of that brief connection, that it had meant nothing to him, even if it had meant everything to her foolish young heart. Lady Pemberton was watching her with an expression that suggested she suspected more than Eleanor was willing to admit, but mercifully she did not press the point. "Well?" she said, pouring more tea into both their cups. "Regardless of your personal connection or lack thereof, the Duke's return has certainly created quite a stir. He has taken up residence in the Ashford House in Berkeley Square, which has been closed these 15 years and required an army of servants to make habitable again. He has been seen walking in the park, attending a performance at the theatre, and calling upon various members of his family. Mrs. Bickers Whitmore reports that he looks older than his years, which I suppose is to be expected given his history, and that he shows no interest in the social entertainments that once occupied him. He declined Lady Hertford's invitation to her annual ball, and he has not appeared at any of the usual gatherings where a duke would be expected to show himself." Eleanor listened to this recitation of the Duke's movements with an attention she could not quite suppress, even as she told herself that his presence in London was a matter of complete indifference to her. "What brings him back now?" she asked, attempting to sound merely politely curious. "After 15 years, why return at all?" Lady Pemberton shrugged elegantly. "Estate business, one assumes. Properties to inspect, accounts to review, tenants to visit." The duties of a dukedom cannot be managed entirely from abroad, no matter how skilled one's steward, and perhaps after 15 years of exaltoire, even grief becomes a more portable burden. Perhaps he simply grew tired of running from his past and decided to face whatever awaits him in England. The conversation moved on to other topics: the engagement of a mutual acquaintance, the new exhibition at the Royal Academy, the shocking price of coal this winter. But Eleanor found herself only half listening, her mind circling obsessively around the news of Thomas Bancroft's return. When she finally took her leave and walked back through the darkening streets toward her modest townhouse, she felt as though the London she had inhabited just hours before had subtly shifted, as though his presence in the city had altered some fundamental aspect of her reality, even though they moved in completely different spheres and would almost certainly never encounter one another. She arrived home to find Charlotte in the small sitting room attempting to master a complicated piece on the pianoforte, and the girl looked up with a smile as Eleanor entered. "How was Lady Pemberton, Aunt? Did she have any interesting gossip to share?" Eleanor removed her cloak and gloves, considering how to answer. "The Duke of Ashford has returned to London after many years abroad," she said, aiming for a neutral tone. "It has caused quite a sensation in certain circles." Charlotte's fingers stilled on the keys. "The Duke of Ashford. Is that the gentleman who lost his wife and child in Italy? I have heard Mamma speak of him. She says he was quite the prize during his season, handsome and charming and much pursued." Eleanor nodded, moving toward the fire to warm her chilled hands. "So I understand, though I knew him only slightly. It was many years ago, and I was not part of the circle that would have claimed his attention." The maid appeared then with a small silver salver bearing a single card, and Eleanor felt her heart lurch in her chest even before she saw what was written there. "Begging your pardon, Miss Ashworth," the maid said, "but this was delivered by a footman in ducal livery just a quarter-hour ago. He said it required no immediate reply, but that his master hoped for a response by tomorrow morning." Eleanor took the card with fingers that trembled slightly, and even in the dim firelight she could see the quality of the heavy cream cardstock, the elegant engraving, the unmistakable crest of the Duke of Ashford embossed in the corner. She broke the seal with care and unfolded the single sheet of paper, her eyes moving over the words, written in a bold, masculine hand. "Miss Eleanor Ashworth," the note began, using the formal address appropriate for an unmarried woman, though the use of her given name suggested a presumption of familiarity that set her pulse racing. "I hope you will forgive the liberty of my writing to you without the benefit of a formal introduction, though I believe we were briefly acquainted during the season of 1838. I have recently returned to London after an extended absence, and I find myself wishing to renew certain connections from that time. Would you do me the honor of receiving me tomorrow afternoon at 3 o'clock? I have a matter of some delicacy I wish to discuss with you, and I believe you may be the only person in London who can provide me with the information I seek. I remain your obedient servant, Thomas Bancroft, Duke of Ashford." Eleanor read the note 3 times, each reading failing to make it any more comprehensible than the first. Charlotte had abandoned the pianoforte and crossed to her aunt's side, her young face alight with curiosity. "What is it, Aunt Eleanor? You have gone quite pale. Is it bad news?" Eleanor looked up from the note, her mind racing through possibilities and finding no rational explanation. "The Duke of Ashford has requested permission to call upon me tomorrow afternoon," she said, her voice sounding strange even to her own ears. "I cannot imagine why. We were never properly introduced. We certainly never had any conversation of substance, and I cannot conceive what matter of delicacy he could possibly wish to discuss with me." Charlotte's eyes widened. "A duke wishes to call on you? Aunt Eleanor, that is extraordinary. You must receive him, of course. You cannot refuse such a request." "Can I not?" Eleanor murmured, sinking into the nearest chair with the note still clutched in her hand. "Charlotte, I am a woman of 38 with no fortune, no connections, no beauty, and no social standing beyond what my family name provides. Dukes do not call upon women like me unless there is some very specific purpose, and I cannot think what that purpose might be. Perhaps he wishes to discuss charity work, Charlotte suggested helpfully. Or perhaps he needs someone to translate Italian documents. You are quite fluent in Italian. Are you not? Or perhaps there is some connection through your family that you have forgotten. Eleanor shook her head slowly. Any of those explanations would require him to know something about my current circumstances, my accomplishments, my family connections. But we have had no contact in 20 years. How would he even know I am in London, let alone where I reside or what my interests might be? The logical course would be to politely decline, to write a brief note explaining that she is not equipped to help him with whatever mysterious matter concerns him, to maintain the boundaries that have kept her safe and unnoticed for 2 decades. But even as Eleanor thought this, she knew she would not refuse him, could not refuse him, because the young girl who had once stood near the potted palms watching him across a ballroom was not entirely dead, and she desperately wanted to know why he remembered her, if indeed he did remember her, and this was not simply some case of mistaken identity or confused recollection. That night, after Charlotte had retired and the house had grown quiet around her, Eleanor lit a candle and climbed the stairs to the attic once more. She retrieved the camphor-wood box and carried it back down to her bedroom, setting it on the small writing desk near the window. The rain had returned, drumming softly against the glass, and in the flickering candlelight she opened the box and withdrew the dance cards, spreading them before her like a fortune-teller's tarot. The Montrose Ball, May 1838. She picked up that particular card and held it close to the candle flame, studying the blank lines as though they might suddenly reveal hidden writing, some secret message that would explain why a duke she had glimpsed only briefly 20 years ago would now seek her company. "Why?" she whispered to the empty room, to the rain and the darkness, and her own reflection ghostly in the window glass. Why, after 20 years, would he remember I exist? The cards offered no answer, maintaining their pristine silence as they had for 2 decades. But tomorrow, Eleanor knew, she would receive the Duke of Ashford in her modest drawing-room, and perhaps then she would learn what connection, what hidden thread, had wound through the years to bind them together across the vast distance of time and circumstance, and all that might have been, but never was. The clock in Eleanor's modest drawing-room chimed the 1/4 hour before 3, and she found herself standing at the window for perhaps the 10th time in as many minutes, her hands smoothing the fabric of her gown with a nervous gesture she could not seem to suppress. She had chosen her most respectable dress, a day gown of deep burgundy wool with modest trim and a high neckline that she knew was at least 3 years behind current fashion, but which had the virtue of making her look dignified rather than desperate. Her hair had been arranged and rearranged by her own hands, as she could not afford a lady's maid for such trivial occasions, and she had settled finally on a simple style that pulled the chestnut strands, now threaded with silver, away from her face and coiled them at the nape of her neck. She had placed fresh flowers on the side table that morning, chrysanthemums in autumnal shades of gold and bronze that she had purchased from the flower seller on the corner at an extravagant price, and she had instructed her single housemaid to prepare tea and lay out the few nice biscuits they kept for company, though what a duke would make of her humble refreshments she could not imagine. The drawing-room itself seemed to have shrunk overnight, its modest proportions suddenly appearing shabby rather than cozy, the worn patches on the upholstery visible in the clear November light, the faded wallpaper showing its age in a way Eleanor had stopped noticing years ago, but which now seemed painfully obvious. This was not a room designed to receive a duke, and she was not a woman prepared to entertain one. Yet here she stood, watching the street below for the arrival of a carriage that would bring Thomas Bancroft back into her life after 20 years of absence. At precisely 3 o'clock, a hansom cab pulled up before her narrow townhouse, and Eleanor watched as a tall figure emerged, his movements deliberate and unhurried despite the chill wind that had picked up since morning. Even from above, even after 2 decades, she recognized something essential in the way he carried himself, a quality of bearing that transcended age or circumstance, though she could see immediately that Lady Pemberton had been correct in saying he looked older than his 55 years. His hair, which had been dark as coal in his youth, had gone almost entirely silver, and even from this distance she could see the lines that grief and time had carved into his face. He paid the driver and stood for a moment looking up at her house, his expression unreadable, and Eleanor stepped back from the window quickly, her heart hammering against her ribs in a way that seemed absurd for a woman of 38, who should long ago have outgrown such adolescent reactions. She heard the knock at the door, heard her maid's footsteps in the hall, heard the murmur of voices as the Duke was admitted and divested of his coat and hat. And then the door to the drawing-room opened, and he was there, filling her small space with his presence in a way that seemed to alter the very air she breathed. "Miss Ashworth," he said, and his voice was exactly as she remembered it, deep and cultured, with a slight roughness at the edges that suggested emotion held carefully in check. "Thank you for agreeing to receive me. I know my request must have seemed strange, and I am grateful for your forbearance." Eleanor curtsied, the gesture automatic after years of training, though her legs felt unsteady beneath her. "Your Grace," she managed, pleased that her voice emerged clear and composed despite the chaos of her thoughts. "You are most welcome. Please, won't you sit?" She gestured to the better of her 2 armchairs, positioned near the fire, and he moved toward it with a slight hesitation in his step, as though he too felt the strangeness of this encounter. As he sat, she noticed that his hands trembled slightly as he removed his gloves, a barely perceptible tremor that suggested he was not nearly as composed as his formal manner implied. This observation steadied her somehow, the knowledge that she was not alone in her nervousness, and she took her own seat with marginally more grace than she had feared she could manage. For a moment they sat in silence, the social conventions that should have guided their conversation seeming inadequate to the weight of whatever had brought him here. Eleanor found herself studying his face with an attention that would have been rude in any other circumstance, noting how the years had refined his features rather than coarsening them, how his grey eyes, the same color as a winter sea, held depths of sorrow that had not been present in his youth, but which somehow made him more rather than less compelling. He was looking at her with equal intensity, and she felt color rise in her cheeks as she became acutely aware of every imperfection, every line that time had etched around her eyes and mouth, every strand of silver in her hair that marked her as a woman well past her prime. "Your Grace," she began, attempting to break the silence before it became unbearable, "your note mentioned a matter of some delicacy that you wished to discuss. How may I be of assistance to you?" The Duke leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped before him in a gesture that seemed almost supplicating. "Miss Ashworth," he said, and then paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "Forgive me. This is more difficult than I anticipated. I have rehearsed what I wished to say 100 times since deciding to call upon you, and now that I am here, I find that all my careful words have deserted me." He took a breath, and when he spoke again, his voice held a note of something raw and unguarded. "You do not remember me, Miss Ashworth, but I remember you." Eleanor felt as though the floor had tilted beneath her chair. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace, but we were introduced at the Montrose Ball in 1838, were we not? Surely you cannot think I would forget meeting a duke, even briefly." The ghost of a smile touched his lips. "We were introduced, yes, for perhaps 30 seconds in a receiving line, where I exchanged pleasantries with 50 other people whose names and faces I have long since forgotten. But that is not what I mean when I say I remember you. I mean that I remember you specifically, individually, with a clarity that defies reason given how briefly we actually spoke." Eleanor's hand went unconsciously to her hair, tucking back a strand that had already been perfectly secured, a nervous gesture left over from youth. "I do not understand, Your Grace." The Duke's eyes never left her face, and she saw something in them that made her breath catch, a tenderness mixed with regret that spoke of emotions long held in check. "You wore a pale green dress that evening," he said softly, his voice taking on the cadence of memory. Not the vivid greens that were fashionable that season, but something softer, the color of new leaves in spring. You were standing near the potted palms at the south end of the ballroom, partially obscured by the fronds as though you wished to disappear into the foliage entirely. And you were reading a book, Paradise Lost, if I am not mistaken, which you had hidden behind one of the larger pots so that the chaperones would not see and scold you for being unladylike. You looked as though you would rather be anywhere else in the world than at that ball. And I remember thinking that you were the only honest person in the entire room because everyone else was pretending to enjoy themselves, while you alone had the courage to acknowledge that the whole spectacle was rather tedious. Eleanor stared at him, her mind reeling, because every detail he had mentioned was precisely, impossibly correct. She had worn her pale green dress that evening, the one her mother had declared too insipid, but which Eleanor had loved for its quiet elegance. She had positioned herself near the palms because they provided cover, and because no gentleman ever looked for a dancing partner in the shadows. And she had indeed brought Milton's Paradise Lost, the small leather-bound edition that fit in her reticule, and she had read it in stolen moments when she was certain no one was watching. But how could he possibly remember such specifics when they had barely exchanged a dozen words, when she had been just one unremarkable young woman among hundreds at that crowded ball? She began, then stopped, unable to formulate a coherent response. "Your Grace, I do not know what to say." "We spoke for less than a minute, as you yourself acknowledged. How can you possibly remember such details after 20 years? The Duke's expression grew even more serious, and he leaned back in his chair, as though needing the physical distance to maintain his composure. "Some moments, Miss Ashworth, mark us more deeply than we realize at the time," he said quietly. "That evening at the Montrose ball was such a moment for me, though I did not fully understand why until years later. You see, I had just become engaged that very afternoon to Francesca Morelli, the marriage contract signed by our respective families, my fate sealed in exchange for the fortune that would save my estates from ruin. I attended the ball that evening in a state of profound ambivalence, playing my role as the eligible duke while knowing I had just relinquished any claim to choosing my own future. And then I saw you, tucked away among the palms with your contraband book, looking so utterly removed from the mercenary calculations that governed everyone else in that room, and I felt something I had not expected to feel." He paused, and Eleanor saw his throat work as he swallowed hard. "I felt envy," he continued. "Envy of your apparent freedom to simply be yourself, to refuse to participate in the charade, to value your own preferences over society's expectations. And I felt curiosity, a desire to know what you were reading, what you were thinking, whether you found Milton's Satan as compelling as I did. Most of all, I felt a recognition, as though in that crowded ballroom filled with strangers, I had glimpsed someone who might understand what it meant to feel fundamentally at odds with the world we were born into. Eleanor found her voice, though it emerged barely above a whisper. But you were engaged to be married. You left for Italy within the month. Why would you remember a woman you saw for such a brief moment, a woman of no consequence who could offer you nothing? His eyes met hers with an intensity that sent heat through her entire body. That is precisely why I remembered you, Miss Ashworth. Because you offered nothing except the possibility of genuine connection, and I was about to enter a marriage where such connection was impossible. I have thought of you more times than I can count over these 20 years, wondered what became of the woman in the pale green dress, whether she married, whether she found happiness, whether she still read Milton in secret at tedious social gatherings. And when I returned to London and made inquiries through Lady Pemberton, who I knew maintained wide connections, and learned that you were here, unmarried, still yourself as far as I could determine, I knew I had to see you again before I returned to Italy. Eleanor's mind was racing, trying to reconcile this extraordinary confession with everything she had believed about her invisible youth, about her fundamental undesirability, about the season when no one had noticed her existence. But you never approached me after that brief introduction, she said, and she could hear the note of accusation creeping into her voice, despite her best efforts. If I made such an impression, why did you not speak to me, ask me to dance, acknowledge me in some way beyond a glance across a crowded room? The Duke's expression filled with regret so profound it was almost painful to witness. Because I was a coward, Miss Ashworth. Because I was engaged to another woman, and honor demanded I maintain the boundaries appropriate to that commitment. Because I told myself that my momentary fascination with you was merely the rebellion of a man about to enter a cage of his own making, that it would pass once I left England and began my new life. And perhaps most shamefully, because I convinced myself that you would not welcome the attention of a man who could offer you nothing but complications, that it would be kinder to leave you undisturbed than to draw you into the mess of my circumstances. He stood abruptly and moved to the window, his back to her, his shoulders tense beneath his perfectly tailored coat. I was wrong on all counts, he said, his voice rough. The fascination did not pass. The years in Italy with Francesca were cordial but empty, and when she died, I mourned the waste of her young life and the child we had created. But I could not mourn the loss of a love that had never existed between us. And I have spent 15 years in exile wondering about the choices I did not make, the conversations I did not have. The woman in the pale green dress who represented a path I lacked the courage to even consider. Eleanor rose from her chair and crossed to stand a few feet behind him, close enough that she could see the silver threading through his dark hair, close enough that she could speak quietly and still be heard. Why tell me this now? Your Grace, she asked, what purpose does it serve to reveal feelings that are 20 years past their moment to unsettle the peace I have made with my life? He turned to face her, and she saw tears standing in his eyes, though they did not fall. Because I am 55 years old, Miss Ashworth, and I have learned that regret is a far heavier burden than risk. Because I could not leave London without knowing whether the woman I remembered still existed, or whether time had transformed you into someone I would not recognize. And because... He took a breath, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. I needed to know whether I was alone in feeling that brief connection, or whether perhaps you felt it too, and have spent these years wondering, as I have, about what might have been. Eleanor looked into his grey eyes, and saw vulnerability and hope and fear all mingled together, and she felt something crack open in her chest, some protective shell she had built around her heart to guard against exactly this kind of dangerous possibility. I felt it, she admitted, the words emerging before she could think better of them. When our eyes met that evening at the Montrose ball, I felt as though I had been seen for the first time in my life, truly seen, not as the disappointing daughter or the overlooked wallflower, but as myself. It lasted perhaps 5 seconds before someone called your name and you turned away, but I have carried those 5 seconds with me for 20 years like a talisman against the loneliness of being invisible. The Duke's hand reached out, hesitated, then gently took hers, his fingers warm and slightly trembling against her own. "We have both been fools, Eleanor," he said, using her given name for the first time and sending a shiver through her at the intimacy of it. "We have wasted 20 years in separate exiles when we might have—" He stopped, shaking his head. "But I will not compound my foolishness by presuming to know what you want or need now. I have settled my affairs in London more quickly than anticipated, and I am scheduled to return to Italy at month's end. Before I go, I simply wanted you to know that you were not invisible, not to me, and that the fault for my silence lay entirely in my own cowardice, not in any lack on your part." Eleanor felt tears sting her eyes, and one escaped to track down her cheek before she could stop it. "You have given me a gift I did not know I needed, Thomas," she said, emboldened by his use of her given name to reciprocate. "For 20 years I have believed myself fundamentally unworthy of notice, and you have just told me that the man I glimpsed across a ballroom, the man whose face I have remembered with impossible clarity, saw me in return. That knowledge changes something essential about how I understand my own history." He raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, the gesture formal yet somehow deeply intimate. "Then I am glad I found the courage to call upon you, even if it comes 2 decades too late." The maid appeared then with the tea service, breaking the spell of the moment, and they moved apart with the guilty quickness of people caught in an intimacy they have not yet earned the right to claim. They sat again, this time with the tea table between them, and attempted to navigate a more conventional conversation about London, about Italy, about the changes 20 years had wrought in both their lives. But beneath the surface pleasantries, Eleanor felt the ground shifting beneath her carefully ordered existence, felt the walls she had built around her heart developing cracks that let in dangerous light. And she knew with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified her that Thomas Bancroft's return to London, his incomprehensible decision to seek her out, would change everything about the future she had resigned herself to living alone. The pattern established itself with surprising ease over the following fortnight, as Thomas called upon Eleanor every few days at the appointed hour of 3 o'clock, arriving with the punctuality of a man who valued her time, and departing precisely 1 hour later to preserve her reputation, though both of them chafed against the artificial constraint of propriety when their conversations had barely begun to scratch the surface of all they wished to say. The second visit had been less awkward than the first, though still bounded by the formalities that governed interactions between a duke and an unmarried woman of modest means, and they had discussed Italian art with the careful politeness of near strangers who suspected they might become something more. The third visit had seen them debating the merits of various poets, Eleanor defending Wordsworth's romanticism, while Thomas argued for Byron's passionate cynicism, and she had felt a flutter of excitement at the way he listened to her opinions, as though they held genuine value rather than being merely the charming prattle expected of women. By the fourth visit, on a grey December afternoon when the light was already fading by 3:30 and the lamplighters were beginning their rounds in the street below, they had dispensed with much of the formality and settled into a rhythm of conversation that felt less like polite exchange and more like genuine communion between two minds that had been starved for exactly this kind of intellectual and emotional connection. Eleanor had prepared tea herself that afternoon, her single housemaid having been given the afternoon off to visit her ailing mother, and there was something pleasantly domestic about pouring for Thomas, handing him the cup and watching his long fingers curl around the delicate porcelain. They had been discussing philosophy, specifically the question of whether loneliness was a chosen state or an imposed condition. And Eleanor had argued passionately that society created categories of acceptable and unacceptable solitude, that a woman alone was pitied or scorned, while a man alone was respected for his independence. Thomas had countered that all loneliness, regardless of gender, carried the weight of paths not taken and connections not made, and that his 15 years in Italy had taught him that X could be as much internal as external, that one could be utterly alone in a crowded ballroom or find connection in perfect solitude if one's mind was engaged with ideas that transcended physical presence. The conversation had grown increasingly personal, the philosophical abstractions giving way to lived experience, and Eleanor found herself speaking with unusual candor about her debut season, about the humiliation of standing against the wall night after night, about the slow death of hope, as she realized that no gentleman would ever look past her plain face and serious demeanor to discover the person beneath. She spoke of her sister Catherine's effortless success, of watching her dance card fill within minutes while Eleanor's remained blank, of the well-meaning pity from matrons who suggested she might find fulfillment in charitable works since marriage seemed unlikely, of the gradual acceptance that she would live her life on the margins of society, observed but never truly seen. Thomas listened with an attention so complete it was almost painful, his grey eyes never leaving her face, and she saw something building in his expression, some emotion struggling against the constraints of propriety and caution. Finally, unable to bear the weight of all that remained unspoken between them, Eleanor set down her teacup and looked directly at him, gathering courage she had not known she possessed. "Thomas," she said, using his given name with the familiarity they had established over these visits, "I must ask you something, and I need you to answer with complete honesty, even if the truth is difficult. Why did you truly seek me out after all these years? You have spoken of remembering me from the Montrose ball, of being curious about what became of me, but there are hundreds of people from your past you might have inquired after, hundreds of connections you might have renewed. Why me? Why a woman you barely knew, a woman of no particular consequence, who can offer you nothing of value?" The Duke's composure, which had remained largely intact through their previous conversations, finally cracked. He stood abruptly and moved to the window, his back to her, his shoulders rigid with tension, and for a long moment he did not speak. Eleanor waited, her heart hammering against her ribs, afraid that she had pushed too far, that she had violated some unspoken boundary and would now pay the price of his withdrawal. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion barely contained. "Because I attended every ball you did during that season, Eleanor," he said, the words emerging as though torn from some deep place within him. "Not for the social obligations, not to fulfill my duties as an eligible duke, but because I found myself watching for you." He turned to face her, and she saw that his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I would arrive at whatever ballroom or assembly was on the calendar that evening, and my eyes would scan the room until I found you, always in the same position, always near the edges, always half hidden, as though you wished to disappear entirely. And once I located you, I would position myself where I could observe you throughout the evening, stealing glances whenever I thought no one would notice, watching you read when you thought no one was looking, noting the way you occasionally smiled at something in your book, or the way your fingers would tap against your reticule in time with the music, even though you never danced." Eleanor felt her worldview tilting, everything she had believed about her invisible youth suddenly revealed as a lie, and she could not speak, could only stare at him as he continued. "I was engaged to Francesca," he said, his voice breaking slightly on the name. The contracts had been signed. The settlements agreed upon. My honor demanded that I maintain appropriate boundaries with all other women. But my heart, foolish and rebellious as it was, had fixed itself on you with an intensity that frightened me. I told myself it was merely the enchantment of what I could not have, the universal human tendency to want what is forbidden. I told myself that you were simply a fantasy I had constructed, that the real woman could not possibly be as compelling as the figure I observed from across crowded rooms. I told myself that once I left for Italy and began my life with Francesca, this inexplicable fascination would fade like morning mist. He crossed back to his chair and sank into it, his hands gripping the armrests as though he needed something solid to anchor him. But it did not fade, Eleanor. Not in Italy. Not during the 5 years of my marriage, not in the 15 years since Francesca's death. Do you know what haunted me in that villa in Venice, alone with my grief and guilt? It was not my wife's face I saw in my mind's eye, though I mourned her wasted youth and the child who never drew breath. It was your face the way you looked at the Cavendish ball in that ivory gown with the seed pearl trim, standing near the refreshment table and examining the flower arrangements as though they were works of art worthy of serious contemplation. It was your face at the Pemberton Musicale, when you closed your eyes during a particularly beautiful aria, and I saw such longing in your expression that I wanted to cross the room and ask what you were thinking, what dreams you harbored that the music called forth. Eleanor's hands had begun to tremble, and she gripped them together in her lap to still them. You are telling me that while I stood against the wall, believing myself beneath notice, invisible to everyone in the room, you were watching me, she said, and her voice emerged barely above a whisper. Every ball, every assembly, every musicale and garden party and literary evening, you were aware of my presence. He nodded, and now the tears did fall, tracking down his weathered cheeks without shame. Every moment I could manage without drawing attention, he confirmed. I remember every gown you wore, Eleanor, the pale green at Montrose, the ivory at Cavendish, the rose pink at the Hartley ball that made your complexion glow, despite what conventional beauty standards might say. I remember that you favored the left side of any ballroom because the light was better for reading. I remember that you would sometimes mouth the words to the music when a waltz was playing, as though you were dancing in your imagination even while your feet remained still. I remember the evening at Lady Worthington's when you laughed at something you read, a full, genuine laugh that you quickly stifled, and I wanted more than anything to know what had amused you, to share in that moment of joy. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her own face now, not from sadness but from the overwhelming realization that her entire understanding of her past had been built on a foundation of false assumptions. I thought no one saw me, she said, her voice breaking. I thought I was invisible, unworthy of attention, fundamentally undesirable. I built my entire life around that belief, constructed my sense of self around the knowledge that I was the woman no one chose, no one wanted, no one remembered. And now you are telling me that the man whose face I also remember with impossible clarity, the man I glimpsed across those same ballrooms and wondered about in the privacy of my thoughts, was watching me in return. She stood abruptly and crossed to where he sat, propriety forgotten in the rush of emotion. "Why did you never speak to me?" she demanded, and her voice carried 20 years of hurt and confusion. "If I meant something to you, if you felt this connection you describe, why did you let me believe I was invisible? Why did you leave for Italy without a word, without even a proper goodbye, without giving me the chance to know that someone, anyone, had seen me?" Thomas rose to meet her, and for a moment they stood facing each other in the gathering dusk, the room around them fading into shadow as the last of the afternoon light died beyond the windows. "I was a coward," he said simply. "I was engaged to another woman, bound by honor and family obligation, and the very real need to save my estates from financial ruin. Approaching you would have been a betrayal of Francesca, who had done nothing to deserve such treatment, and it would have complicated your life in ways that seemed unfair when I could offer you nothing but scandal. I told myself I was being noble by maintaining my distance, by allowing you to live your life undisturbed by my inconvenient feelings. But the truth is that I was simply afraid of what it might mean to acknowledge the depth of what I felt afraid of the choices I might be forced to make if I gave voice to emotions that had no acceptable outlet." His hand reached out, hesitated in the space between them, then gently touched her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear. "I have carried the regret of my silence for 20 years, Eleanor," he said softly. "Every day in Italy, every evening I sat alone in that villa, watching the sun set over the lagoon. I wondered what might have happened if I had found the courage to break my engagement, to choose my heart over my duty, to offer you the chance to know me as I longed to know you. I told myself that such thinking was foolish, that I was romanticizing what had been merely a passing attraction, that you had probably married and forgotten me entirely. But when my steward's reports mentioned in passing that Miss Eleanor Ashworth of London remained unmarried, I began to wonder whether perhaps you too had carried something from that season, some fragment of recognition that had shaped the years that followed." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat, and she found herself leaning into his touch, the warmth of his palm against her face sending shivers through her entire body. "I never married because no one ever asked," she admitted. "But the deeper truth is that no one ever asked because I never allowed anyone close enough to consider it. I compared every man I met to a memory, to a face I had glimpsed across a ballroom, to 5 seconds of eye contact that I convinced myself I had imagined or inflated into significance it never possessed. I thought I was preserving my dignity by accepting my solitary fate, but perhaps I was simply waiting, hoping that someday the man who had seemed to see me that one brief moment might return and confirm that I had not imagined the connection I felt." They stood thus in the darkening room, his hand still cupping her face, her eyes locked with his, and the sounds of London beyond the windows, the clip of horses' hooves on cobblestones, the call of vendors closing their stalls for the evening, the distant rumble of carriages, all faded into insignificance against the enormity of what was passing between them. Thomas's other hand rose to frame her face, and he looked at her with such intensity that she felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with physical nakedness and everything to do with being truly seen, not as the overlooked wallflower or the resigned spinster, but as Eleanor, complete and whole and worthy of the devotion she saw reflected in his grey eyes. "When Francesca died," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I thought I would never feel anything again beyond guilt and grief. I exiled myself to Italy not because I could not bear England, but because I could not bear the thought of returning to the ballrooms where I had first seen you, of walking streets where I might glimpse you and be forced to confront all the choices I had made that led me away from the life I truly wanted. But isolation and grief are poor companions, Eleanor, and they taught me that regret is a far heavier burden than risk. I am 55 years old, too old perhaps to believe in second chances, but I could not leave London without telling you the truth, without giving you the knowledge that you were never invisible, not to me, that every moment I stole to watch you across those ballrooms was a moment I treasured more than all the dances I shared with women whose names I cannot now remember." Eleanor felt something break open in her chest, some tightly wound spring of loneliness and resignation that had been coiled there for decades, and she reached up to cover his hands with her own, holding them against her face as though she could anchor this moment, make it real and permanent, rather than allowing it to slip away like so many other possibilities in her life had slipped away. "I see you, Thomas," she whispered. "Just as you saw me then, I see you now. Not the duke or the title or the tragic figure returned from exile, but the man who remembered which side of the ballroom I preferred, who noticed when I laughed at something in my book, who carried the memory of a woman in a pale green dress for 20 years when he could have chosen to forget. That seeing, that being seen in return, is the most precious gift anyone has ever given me." He leaned forward slowly, giving her every opportunity to withdraw, and pressed his forehead against hers, their breath mingling in the small space between them. "We have wasted so much time," he said, and she heard the ache of lost years in his voice. "I cannot give you back the dances you should have had, the courtship you deserved, the youth we might have shared if I had been braver." Eleanor's hands slid from his to rest against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. "Then do not give me the past," she said firmly. "Give me the present. Give me the truth of what you feel now, not what you felt 20 years ago. Give me the possibility of a future I stopped allowing myself to imagine." His arms came around her then, pulling her close in an embrace that defied every rule of propriety, but felt more right than any socially sanctioned interaction Eleanor had ever experienced. And she rested her head against his shoulder, feeling the solidity of him, the reality of his presence, after so many years of existing only in memory. They stood thus as full darkness fell beyond the windows, and the room around them dissolved into shadow. Two people who had spent 20 years in separate exiles finally finding their way back to the moment of recognition they had been too afraid to claim the first time. And Eleanor felt the walls of her modest drawing room contract around them as though the entire world had narrowed to just this space, this man, this miraculous second chance that neither of them had dared to hope for, but both had secretly longed for across all the years of loneliness and longing. They remained in that embrace for a long moment, the darkness deepening around them, until Eleanor finally stirred and stepped back reluctantly, suddenly aware that they had been standing pressed together in a manner that would scandalize anyone who might have witnessed it, though the privacy of her modest drawing room and the dismissal of her housemaid meant there were no witnesses to their impropriety. She moved to light the candles, her hands shaking slightly as she touched flame to wick, and the warm glow pushed back the shadow, revealing Thomas still standing where she had left him, his expression a mixture of wonder and something that looked like hope tempered by the painful knowledge of time lost. They settled back into their chairs, the intimacy of the moment not dissipated, but transformed into something that hummed between them like a living thing, and Eleanor found herself speaking without conscious thought, the words emerging from some deep place that had been locked away for decades. "I kept them, you know," she said quietly. "The dance cards from that season, every single one, blank as the day they were printed." Thomas's eyes sharpened with interest and something else, something that looked like pain. "You kept them," he repeated. "After all these years, you preserved evidence of that unhappy time." Eleanor nodded, rising from her chair with sudden decision, as though if she hesitated she might lose her nerve entirely. "Wait here," she said, and left the drawing room before he could respond, climbing the stairs to her bedroom, where the camphorwood box still sat on her writing desk from the night she had examined its contents after receiving his note. She carried the box back down carefully, as though it contained something fragile and precious rather than mere cardstock and faded memories. And when she re-entered the drawing room, Thomas stood immediately, his entire bearing shifting to one of heightened attention. She set the box on the small writing desk near the window and lifted the lid, withdrawing the 12 dance cards and spreading them across the surface like a card reader laying out a fortune, except these cards spoke only of absence and invisibility rather than destiny and fate. "These are my testament," she said, her voice steady, though her hands trembled as she arranged them. "My proof that I existed on the margins of society's glittering world, that I attended all the required events, wore all the appropriate gowns, learned all the proper steps, and still remained fundamentally unseen. I told Charlotte I kept them as a reminder that my worth is not determined by whether a gentleman signed a card, but the truth is more complicated." She paused, looking down at the pristine ivory rectangles with their elegant gold filigree borders and empty lines. "I kept them because they are the most honest record of who I was during that season. More honest than any journal entry or letter home. They do not lie or embellish or soften the reality. They simply exist in their blankness. A perfect representation of how I moved through those months, present but unacknowledged, visible but unseen." Thomas approached the desk slowly, as though the cards might vanish if he moved too quickly, and when he reached Eleanor's side, he looked down at them with an expression of such profound sorrow that she had to resist the urge to gather them up and hide them away, to spare him whatever pain they caused. "May I?" he asked quietly, gesturing to the cards, and when she nodded, he picked up the first one with hands that trembled noticeably. "The Montrose Ball," he read aloud, his voice rough. "May 12th, 1838. He studied the card for a long moment, his thumb tracing the empty lines where names should have been inscribed, and Eleanor saw his throat work as he swallowed hard. "I remember this evening," he said softly. "You wore the pale green dress, and you were reading Paradise Lost behind the potted palm. I wanted to approach you, to ask if you preferred Milton's Satan or his God, whether you found the fallen angel sympathetic or irredeemable. But I had just announced my engagement that very afternoon, and I stood across the ballroom watching you and hating myself for my cowardice." He set down the first card and picked up the second, the Cavendish ball, and his expression shifted to something even more pained. "April 28th, 1838, he read. "You wore ivory silk with seed pearls at the neckline and hem. I remember thinking you looked like moonlight given human form, cool and luminous and utterly out of place among the gaudy colors the other young ladies favored. You stood near the refreshment table for most of the evening, and I watched you examine the flower arrangements as though they were works of art in a museum, your face completely absorbed in studying the way the roses had been arranged with ferns and baby's breath." Eleanor stared at him, unable to comprehend how he could recall such specific details from events that had occurred 2 decades ago, events she herself remembered only in broad strokes of humiliation and loneliness. "How can you possibly remember what I wore?" she whispered. "I barely remember myself, and I was the one wearing the gowns." Thomas set down the second card and looked at her with eyes that held 20 years of regret. "Because I committed every detail to memory, Eleanor. Because those stolen glances were all I allowed myself, and so I hoarded them like a miser hoards gold, examining each memory over and over during the years that followed." He picked up another card, then another, working through the stack methodically. The Pemberton Musicale, the Hartley Ball, the Worthington Garden Party, the Assembly at Almack's. For each one, he recited the date, described what she had worn, recalled where she had positioned herself, noted what she had been doing. The accuracy of his recollections was almost frightening in its precision, as though he had been keeping a detailed journal of her movements, and Eleanor felt her carefully constructed understanding of that season crumbling entirely, replaced by this alternate history where she had been the object of devoted attention from the one man whose regard she had secretly craved. When he had examined all 12 cards, he set them down in a neat row across her writing desk and stood looking at them in silence, his jaw tight with emotion. "May I ask you something?" he said finally, and Eleanor nodded, though she felt almost afraid of what he might request. "These cards, they represent dances that should have been claimed, partners who should have signed them, a season that should have been filled with the normal pleasures of a young woman's debut." He turned to face her fully. "If I could go back, if I could undo my cowardice and my silence, I would sign every single one of these cards. I would claim every dance, every waltz and quadrille and country reel, every moment you spent standing alone against the wall. Since I cannot change the past, would you permit me to at least acknowledge what should have been, to fill these empty lines with the name that should have been there from the beginning?" Eleanor's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she could not speak.